All right, it is 6:05. I want to welcome everyone officially on behalf of the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, AWAB for short. We're glad to be able to host this evening's webinar. This is a new experience for AWAB, so as we work through this and any technical challenges, please be patient with us, and we will in advance thank you for being gracious. It is a real gift for us to be able to offer this Welcoming the Transgender Community webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars that we will be offering, and I am delighted to be able to introduce Donnie Anderson, who is a member of our AWAB board and who really has helped to give shape and form to tonight's webinar. So Donnie, I'm going to hand it off to you, and again, everyone, as you are joining us, feel free to use the chat. If you have a question, feel free to use the Q&A feature, and we will do our best as we work through the next hour to connect with you all as best as we can and to respond to as many questions as possible. But Donnie, thank you for your leadership and willingness to help facilitate our discussion this evening.
Thank you, Brian. As Brian said, I am Reverend Dr. Donnie Anderson. I'm the pastor of the New Bedford Church, Pilgrim United Church of Christ, live in Providence, Rhode Island, and do a lot of advocacy on behalf of transgender issues. Joining me tonight is Erica Saunders, who is the pastor of Peace Community Church in Oberlin, Ohio, and Dante Tavallaro, rector of St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Greenville, Rhode Island. I'm speaking on college campuses and in community and faith communities. I've found a number of people who are interested in the transgender community, but they don't know how to start the conversation. They're awkward, they don't want to ask the wrong question. And so tonight, this is what this is. This is the beginning of a conversation. We have invited two young, active pastors. All three of us are engaged in congregations at the moment, and we're delighted to be here. Here's how our agenda is going to go tonight. We'll start by each of us sharing a little bit about our own story, and then each of us will share one thing that we've chosen that we think might be helpful for you to know in order to help you become more comfortable with the transgender community. After that, there'll be some time for questions and answers before we tie things up. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time introducing the two folks who are with us, because we could spend the rest of their time talking about the marvels of these two people. I just feel so privileged to be able to share a panel with them tonight. So let's get started. And Erica is first up.
Thank you, Donnie, for that introduction. And thank you to AWAB and all of you for spending time with us tonight. As Donnie said, my name is Erica, and I'm a trans woman. That means I was assigned male at birth, but I have transitioned socially, medically, and legally to live my life as the woman that God created me to be. As long as I can remember, I felt different, especially when it came to gender stuff. You see, I never fit in with the other boys. And that made me feel like a freak. And it made me feel like something was wrong with me, because when I was alone, either out playing in the yard or in those last moments before falling asleep, I knew that I had a secret. I felt like a girl on the inside. Nobody else felt that way, or so I thought. And that feeling was so strong, in fact, that once or twice before she was old enough to remember or really tell other people, I would ask my younger sister to pray with me that we would wake up having switched bodies so that things would be set right with the world, at least for me. And I didn't learn that other people felt like I did until I was in high school. That was in the late aughts, when I learned what the word transgender meant. But I still felt shame around this feeling that I had, this identity that I knew I was, because of what I heard preached in church, a little independent Baptist community in rural North Carolina. Queer and trans folks went against God's plan. Acting on such desires were sinful, and people like me who followed that path belonged in hell. And so I did what a lot of other trans people did, and I pushed that feeling deep down until I just couldn't hold it in anymore. And I came out by accident on my last day of undergraduate studies in 2016, when I was celebrating the upcoming graduation with my friends in a way that lessened my inhibitions, and I just let them know. Luckily, they were very accepting, and they started calling me Erica, and they gave me fashion tips. And just a few months later, on my first day of graduate school at Wake Forest University School of Divinity, I started transitioning full-time. That means I changed my name legally. I shifted the way that I dressed and wore my hair, and I received various medical interventions, treatments, so that I could become comfortable in my body. And for the first time, divine presence became real for me, because I was able to interact with others authentically, not hiding who I was or having so much of my attention and my mind taken up by the television static that I often compared gender dysphoria to. I learned how to love others, and perhaps more importantly, how to be loved. And isn't that what God wants for all of God's creation? Today, I couldn't feel happier, and I thank God for every day that I get to live my truth. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Erica. And now let's come back to the East Coast and be with the rector of St. Thomas Episcopal Church. We're so happy to have Dante Tavallaro, bread maker extraordinaire, with us.
Well, thank you, Donnie. I will say on the bread side, I just got a pan to make pain de mie or Pullman loaf, so it's a whole new bread world here in my apartment in Providence. Thank you so much for having me here. As Donnie said, my name is Dante Tavallaro. I'm the rector of St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Greenville, Rhode Island, and rector is just a fancy way of saying I'm the head priest there. And I have tenure, so there's very little my congregation can do right now to get rid of me, and I enjoy reminding them of that. So my story kind of began where I, growing up, was a tomboy, and that was great because most of the other girls in my class growing up were tomboys. We played lots of sports. We had kind of this cohort, and we played ice hockey together. On the Providence Lady Reds was the team, the kind of travel team we played for, and we played softball and all of these things. And then there was a moment in like the summer between 5th and 6th grade where all tomboys up, and then we start school day 1 of 6th grade, and I was the only tomboy left. And I felt like I had missed this memo. Like everybody else got this invitation except for me. And that became this moment for me in my life where it became the girls and D, and then later on the guys and D, where I just kind of dwelt in this liminal space between lots of things, and no one really quite knew what to do with me. My mom growing up, in her life, she was a big time athlete. She went to college on a softball scholarship. And so I think a lot of people who knew me and knew my family was like, oh, you're just like your mother. You're just an athlete and you happen to be just kind of a bigger person. I was the tallest kid in my class for most of elementary school. And but as elementary school ended and middle school began, it became very clear I was not, one of these things was not like the other. And I didn't quite know where that was because I didn't really have any language around to talk about gender identity or anything like that. I just knew I fit in more with the boys than I did with the girls. For me at that same time, in 7th grade, my vocation to priesthood starts to emerge. And so my vocation to the priesthood and my identity as a trans person became very much linked together for me. I was, I don't know what is true in Baptist churches, but in the Episcopal Church, when you're in 7th grade and you say, I want to be a priest, people make a big deal about that. And so I instantly got involved in all these things. And by the time I'm in high school, I'm, in leadership positions in Rhode Island in our diocese. By the end of high school, I'm going to national conventions for the Episcopal Church. And just kind of put on this fast track within the Episcopal Church. All of that's happening as the Episcopal Church is electing Gene Robinson as the Bishop of New Hampshire, the first openly gay bishop. And that's, for me, was the moment where it was like, it was the, oh, it's hitting the fan moment, because queer identity and church aren't going to be able to mix together. And I heard a lot of hateful and horrible things, and got really angry at God, though I didn't tell anybody. I just kind of kept it all bubbling. And I'm an Italian. We're good at just keeping things inside, randomly yelling, and then just moving on. And so it took me a while to start to integrate my vocation and my identity. And it wasn't until I was in college where church was the last place I came out. And if you've ever been to Rhode Island, it's a very small place. Everyone knows each other and they're probably related. And so I was out in college as trans. I was out in organizations within the state, youth LGBT organizations, and I was out hanging out at the mall with some friends and ran into people from church and thought I was going to have a stroke because my chest got so tight because I'm like, the worlds were colliding. So after that, I made the decision to come out to the priest at the parish I was at the time. And I was super, super nervous. And I sit him down and I finally tell him, I blurt out the words, I'm trans and I want to start using male pronouns for me. And he pauses and he doesn't say anything. I'm like, great, I'm about to get kicked out of the church. Awesome. And he said, in the words of Mr. Rogers, I love you just the way you are. Pause for another, what felt like a bajillion years. And then he adds, and if anyone gives you a hard time, you tell me and I'll take care of it. And this guy, this priest, he really stepped up. So when I legally changed my name, he's the one who went with me to the court hearing, in probate court to do that. As we were at the National Convention for the Episcopal Church, and I was authoring legislation to include gender identity expression, he made sure to get up and testify because he's like, you shouldn't have to do this, let me do it. And he also recognized as a cis straight man, his voice carried a little more weight than mine did on that issue. And so that was it. And then I was the first out trans person to serve the governing body of the whole Episcopal Church, and the first out trans person here as an ordained person in Rhode Island. There have been ways where that's been just a pure gift, because it's opened up lots of connections. I've met lots of people in really interesting ways. And then there's been also ways it's a real challenge. When I got called to the current parish I serve, a handful of people left because they don't think that I should be a priest, that queer people, that trans people, that gay people shouldn't work with children and all sorts of things. And I can't say that I'm sad that they left the parish, because that has made my life a little easier. But that's just part of the reality. And we try to hold, at least I try in the congregation, hold that space of, it's hard, but I want people who don't understand to stay in the community, because I want us to figure out how do we do this together. Because for us as Anglicans, the big thing is we don't have to agree, but we stay in communion with one another. And we kind of go up to that altar rail and we kneel week after week and receive communion. And so I've got some folks who are doing that and they don't quite understand. And but we're working it out together. And so it's quite the experience and journey. And besides making bread and cooking, when I'm not doing the whole church thing, I play in the Providence Gay Flag Football League, which is part of the National Gay Flag Football League. And what's great about being there is I've kind of become the chaplain in that space. And it's been the first space really for my life where trans, fine, the priesthood thing was seen as suspect. And so it's great kind of to be in this world where I get to see it from both sides now, and sometimes in the same day, which is quite a fun way to do life in ministry. So it's a quick little bit about me.
Thank you so much, Dante and Erica. And I think already you may be seeing that these are two very different journeys, but there are things that overlap. There are some things that ring true in both stories. For me, I knew as a child that something was different about me. And finally, at 9 years of age, I had put together a whole way of talking to my mom and went and talked to my mom. And that conversation did not go well. And I now understand that at 9 years of age, I entered a deep, dark closet. I shut the door. I bolted it tight. And for 6 decades, I lived in that closet. There were times, more than a few, when my true self banged on the door of that closet like crazy. But I kept it down. And then finally, it just got to be too much. When I finally understood who and what I was, because in the middle 1950s, if you were male and had an inclination towards the feminine, that meant you were gay. But that didn't work for me because I was always attracted to girls. And as I got older, women. So there was no definition, there was no language. And all I knew was that everything that I had learned in church gave me the idea that I didn't know what it was, but it must be bad. And so it had to stay there. I too felt the call to ministry in my youth and pursued that, and have gratefully spent my career in a variety of ministry settings and really enjoyed that. Finally, in August of 2017, I came out to my family and then ultimately to the world. I was 69 years of age. I was serving as the executive minister of the Rhode Island State Council of Churches, and I quite honestly didn't know what the impact would be on my family or my career. I will be eternally grateful to the board of the Rhode Island State Council of Churches, who unanimously voted to support my transition and to keep my job open for me when they gave you a sabbatical to socially transition. So I actually had a job to come back to. There were some nasty things. I've been called about every type of heretic that you can imagine, and some I didn't even know existed. But I can tell you that overwhelmingly, both from within the faith community and with people outside the faith community, there's just been so much more support. People have said, we're happy for you. You seem happier than you've ever been in your whole life. And I'm genuinely grateful for that. my dream as I was thinking about transitioning was to be able to live out authentically as a minister. The picture in my mind was a pink clergy shirt with the collar. I have one of those. I wear it quite often. In fact, I wear it just about every Sunday. I almost wore it tonight, but it's that was my dream. And now I get to live that dream every single day. I wake up in the morning and I say, I can live today as authentically as I am. I can just be me. And I go to bed at night and say, thank you, God, for another day when I get to be me. How grateful I am that there's this marvelous church in New Bedford, Massachusetts, that's crazy enough to invite me to pastor and be there and for us to work together on, for the sake of the kingdom of God, and to see those folks do wonderful things. The big thing I just want to share when I go out and share with people is that I hope that young people today and others as well will never have to struggle with the question I struggled with and which I know others struggle with. And that is that I have to make a choice. I can either be authentically who I am, or I can be a person of faith, but I can't be both. I'm here as living testimony to the fact that you can be both. And I am so grateful that even though there are some people in the church who use a hermeneutic that was used by people in the antebellum South to support slavery and the biblical view of slavery, they use that same hermeneutic today to support an anti-LGBTQ plus agenda. But I'm so grateful that the gospel of Jesus is not that, and that God's grace is open to me, and I get to come to God just as I am. And for that, I am grateful. Well, that's just a little bit of who we are. Brian, did you want to say something? I see you went off mute. Did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Donnie. I just wanted to remind everyone, again, I want to welcome everyone who's with us. We've had several people join since we officially began. Please feel free to use the chat feature. I know that has been pretty active. If you have a specific question, we are going to reach a point where we will have a little bit of a Q&A. And so if you have a specific question, please feel free to use the Q&A feature in the bottom of your screen. And please ask your question specifically as you would like it to be asked. And we will do our best to entertain all the questions that are offered. Thanks, Donnie.
Great. Okay, so it's time for us to share one thing. And again, this isn't intended to be a comprehensive webinar. This is an introduction. We're just trying to stimulate some thinking and get you going. So from the northwestern quarter, or almost the northwestern quarter of Rhode Island, let's hear what Dante has to suggest and a thought for us. Dante?
So it was very hard to think of one thing. I have to say it was very, very challenging. But the one thing that I think is really important, particularly for folks who are just beginning this conversation, and for communities that are beginning this conversation, is just upfront accept and know and come to terms with the fact that you're gonna fail. Like, you're gonna mess things up, you're gonna get stuff wrong. And so I think having that posture of just knowing that up front can help then to be prepared to be corrected, and to help keep a posture of openness to continue to learn and to not get defensive of like, wait, but I thought I had this down, but because it's always changing. I mean, even I talk to folks who are younger than I am in the trans and gender nonconforming community. I'm like, oh, wow, I got that way wrong. And so even just because I'm in the community doesn't mean that I still don't have to learn and don't get things wrong. And so I think it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when, and then always being prepared to learn and continue to grow.
Great, thanks, Dante. Erica, what have you got to share?
Yeah, I would like to paraphrase the Black lesbian poet and activist Pat Parker for my one thing. And this is a paraphrase of her poem, "For the White Person Who Wants to Know How to Be My Friend." the first thing you do is to forget that I'm trans. Second, you must never forget that I'm trans. And what I think that that means is that while trans folks have a lot of special needs, especially when we're earlier on in transition, or if we carry some church hurt with us, like lots of us do, that at the end of the day, we're just human beings, and being trans is just one thing about us. So if you have a trans person who shows up in your church, just treat them like you would any other woman, man, or human being. Invite them to the men's Bible study or the ladies' fellowship, or treat them with kindness like you would any other visitor, and engage in authentic relationship with who they are as a person.
Thanks, Erica. Let me share a specific story, but I know this is happening across the country. People are contacting, calls from parents saying, I just found out my child has just told me they're trans. We want to be supportive, but how do we get to be supportive? Some of you are here because you're in churches and you want to be supportive. Let me share with you the story about one church, and I know this isn't the only church that has done this, but this is a story from Berean Baptist Church in the northwestern segment of Rhode Island. The pastor is Reverend Darren Collins, and they had a young person in their church who was transitioning from female to male, and not a large congregation, smaller congregation. And they were wondering, well, what can we do to support this young person? And so what they did was they did a naming ceremony in the church. As part of their worship service, they created a naming ceremony that recognized the change in name as symbolic of recognizing who this person authentically was. Hey, just like for the three of us, the doctors got it wrong at the point of birth. We were assigned the wrong team. But this was a church that came together, and as part of a worship service, did this naming service. And I've met this young person. They are just flying and doing great and wonderful things because of a lot of support from family and from others. But one of the support things was this naming ceremony. And so if your congregation is one of the many congregations that's having young people come out, unlike us, where we felt we had to stifle it, they are living in a society where there's some degree of encouragement. That doesn't mean it's easy for them, but there is some encouragement. They're coming out, and this is one way a church could support them. Well, that's pretty much kind of our initial programmed presentation. Brian, I don't know if there are questions in the Q&A. We're going to have to trust you as a rookie pilot to lead us through this storm and direct the questions.
That's right. Very good. So we do have some coming in. So the first question is from someone who asked, our small congregation is pursuing the conversation about becoming an officially welcoming and affirming congregation. We've had a book study on a book called Heavy Burdens that was really powerful and eye-opening about the experience of hurt and trauma that LGBTQ folks have had in the Christian church. What suggestions might you have for us as we move forward with our conversation? We want the vote and decision to be meaningful rather than pro forma and without substance.
Would like to take that? Erica, Dante? I can take that, I guess. Okay, I've taken the absence of that. I think each of our mainline denominations has an organization that is like AWAB in the Baptist life. Those organizations can be helpful to you in terms of letting you know what you need to do and what steps you need to go through. For some churches, it's a little bit easier than others. For some, it's a very painful process, and it should be approached with prayer and thoughtfulness and consideration for people. But at the end, remembering that all of us in the LGBTQ plus community are people that Jesus died for and that Jesus loves, and that there is help for that. If you happen to be in Baptist life, Brian is the person to talk to, and AWAB is the organization to contact. Let me just add one more thing. Becoming a welcoming and affirming church, or any of the other designations and our other sibling denominations, it's more than just checking off a box. Becoming a welcoming and affirming church is the first step in opening oneself up to a whole community. And by the way, there's some amazing, talented resources in that community that have not been tapped by the church. And there's some wonderful gifts out there just waiting to find a home, maybe in your church. Right?
Good. How can churches better create openness to potential trans pastoral staff members?
As somebody who was discerning a call to congregational ministry and wanting to be a potential trans pastor, I can say a couple things. The first is to really keep in mind the specific needs that a trans pastor or minister might have, especially as that relates to healthcare benefits. That is a really important part of our lives, as for better or worse, our identities are pathologized and rely on our healthcare system to get the kind of life-saving treatment that we need.
Thank you, Erica. Dante or Donnie, any comments on that yourselves? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question.
One of the things that was really important, so the area of Rhode Island's a fairly progressive place, but the area of the state where my congregation is my bishop, as we were talking about my going to St. Thomas, referred to it as Trumplandia adjacent. So not quite there, but bordering on that. And so one of the things that in the call process in the Episcopal Church, where someone from the adjudicatory staff was meeting with the parish leadership, this was a conversation that they had, saying like, okay, Dante's trans, and so let's talk about what that may mean for the congregation. And so I think if in sense of preparing to create openness for a potential trans pastoral staff member, is with some of the existing leadership having conversation to make sure that they're on board with this, because inevitably there'll be an awkward moment or hard and challenging moments, and the rest of the leadership team's got to be able to help support the trans staff member who's coming, so they don't feel that they are left as an island unto themselves to deal with whatever happens.
Great, thanks, Dante. Here's another question. Would you please comment on the place of non-binary in the spectrum of gender and sexual fluidity?
I'll be glad to take a first stab at that, and then it may be important to have the other two do this as well. One of the things that we're finding, and I'll just tell you, I understand myself in a fairly traditional binary way as a woman. That's how I understand myself. Many people, however, are finding the freedom to say that they may not see themselves as necessarily masculine or feminine in the way that we have defined masculinity and femininity in our society. We have adopted a false narrative of a binary. You are either this or you are this. And fortunately, one of the things that's happening in our societies, where we get in terms of mental health and in terms of medical science, is beginning to understand that that really is a false binary. There are many people who do not find themselves in either of those categories. And it's important to provide freedom for people to express themselves the way that they are. I'll finish with this and let the other two pick up. But it's interesting that in the first century of the Common Era, we know that there was a rather vigorous rabbinic school of thought that identified 6 different gender expressions in the Hebrew scripture, indicating that it wasn't just male or female, but there was 6 different gender identities. I don't know what they are. I don't want to know what they are because it's not important, because I'm afraid somebody's going to say, oh, are you now one of the 6? That's not the point. The point is there was recognition that it wasn't just 2. And this is hard for those of us who are older and having grown up in a society all of our lives where we grew up in a gender binary. Trying to wrap our minds around this takes some time. But I will tell you, I've gotten to know some young people who identify as non-binary, and they have been some of the greatest blessings in my life. And they're teaching me. And I'm not the best student in the world, so it sometimes takes a little while. But they're teaching me to try to understand more about this business of not being binary.
Erica or Dante, any comments on that yourselves?
I think one of the things that's, I mean, you know, Donnie's made a comment about being older. I'm 32. I'll be 33 later this year. And when I was coming out, non-binary was not part of the equation. Like that was not like an option on the table. Something anybody talked about. Even as I was coming out, 15 years, 20 years ago. One of the things that I think is that I really appreciate about the non-binary community, it's one of the same reasons why I love the word queer, is because there's not necessarily like when I say the word gay or I say the word trans, like, right, we have all of these things in our mind that come up immediately. But oftentimes when it says queer, you're like, ooh, wait, what do you mean by that? We don't have that same images that come with that right away. What I love about what happens in the non-binary community is that it really becomes each individual really gets to kind of tailor who they are really to them in a way that sometimes some of the other identity labels you don't get to. Because when we think about trans, we think about, oh, right, we know what that means. Or gay, oh, we know what that means. But if somebody says they're non-binary, you then have to ask a lot of questions about what that means for them. It also gives them permission. I think the fluidity of it's also great. I have friends who, there's a parishioner in the church who, the Easter Vigil, they had, came in suit with bow tie, which I was super jealous about because it was a very cool bow tie, and then came to Easter morning mass and had this most stunning floral print dress on. And I think part of that also is that flexibility and fluidity of like, how you wake up that morning, you get the whole spectrum of identity to claim as your own, as opposed to a narrow point on the spectrum.
So picking up on the age piece, this question at one level is addressed to you, Donnie, having heard a bit about your story, but I think it can be answered more broadly too. The question is, or the statement first, I am a 58-year-old and attempting to come out as gender nonconforming and pansexual. Some in my family doubt it because I didn't show any signs when I was younger. What was your coming out experience and reactions?
Thank you. I'll be glad to share that. I thought that I was dropping breadcrumbs all over the place. And I honestly thought that when I came out, my family would say to me, oh, that explains it. Now we understand. Evidently, I did a pretty good job of covering up what's going on inside because they were shocked. I think, we all see what we expect to see. And I was living as a man. People expected to see me be a man. I've always been someone who was not risk adverse. I was always willing to kind of take a chance and do that thing. So even though I did a lot of things poorly, I tried a lot of things. And I think that came across as being masculine. I will tell you that, and so I'm going to get really nitty gritty here. And let me just explain this nitty gritty. Men are supposed to be, studs. They're supposed to be the aggressors in the sexual relationship. One of the issues I suffered from was that was not true of me. I'm more a responder than I am an initiator. And so there were personal parts of my life where I just couldn't do it. Out there in the public, I could do things, I could do other stuff, and I had fun doing it because I liked pushing the envelope. But but when it came down to the deep down important stuff, that isn't who I was. And it's for the person who asked this question, please know that each of us are different. If you found something in any one of our stories tonight that's helpful to you, that's great. But you are your story. And as you explore your own understanding of yourself, and I believe as you ask the Holy Spirit to help you understand that better, that you will know who you are and be able to live into yourself and experience a sense of joy and contentment that has eluded you for those 57 years.
Thank you so much, Donnie. Here's another question. In churches that have very gendered men's fellowship, women's fellowship, how can we move to be more welcoming to folks, not just trans folks, who don't feel like they quote unquote fit? Dante or Erica?
Yeah, so I have never been a huge fan of the gendered group spaces, because even before transition, I never fully felt like I belong. So in Episcopal church, we have a lot of Episcopal parishes have these things called altar guilds. They're the people who set up all the Eucharistic vessels and put out all the hangings and the vestments and all that. It is traditionally women and women of a certain age who are the membership of that group. And I got involved in that as a young kid, and because there was always that's what the older women do. It felt like I'm like, ooh. And so I played it off like, oh, I want to be a priest. So I'm just learning this stuff like this way. Even as a priest in my first parish, there was a men's group. And I'm like, I hated, I went to I think one meeting. So I'm like, this just doesn't feel right. This feels weird that we have this exclusionary space if we're saying that we're an inclusive community. And so in the parish I have now, as we're starting new groups and things, I've just taken the tone of, we're not doing gendered groups. Like, we're not gonna start that, because we want to make sure that everybody feels welcome. And if somebody who's male identified wants to join the altar guild, great. And if people who are identify as female want to join the buildings and grounds team, awesome. I don't want to have to go in the basement to clean things up. If they're willing to do that, great. It's like, and so just kind of, when you're new, you get to kind of set tones in a way. And I'm just like, why create things that are going to make people feel that they don't belong in the community? I don't know about your churches. People aren't banging down the door to come. And so I don't want to give people feel like they have more boundaries of why they can't belong in the community. So I want as open as possible within appropriate boundaries and, polity and blah, 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 and all that stuff. But so I would be a fan of moving away from those gendered spaces and finding ways to make sure that all ministries are welcome of all people.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of what Dante said, I think it brings up the topic of how gender is so worked into our language and how deep our assumptions about gender go. Oftentimes, when there are very gendered spaces, they were built with more traditional gender roles in mind. For instance, at the church that I grew up in, the ladies fellowship was the group that would put together the potlucks for special occasions and would bring casseroles to you if you or one of your family members were sick or having a hard time. I think that is a great ministry for a church to have, right? But it has nothing to do with being a woman or a lady. So you can continue to do these things and just talk about them and advertise them in a different way that really doesn't have much to do with gender at all.
Robin just made a comment, and I just wanted to just piggyback on that. Of if it must be gendered, men or masculine people. I was in a board meeting last night for a summer camp. We're talking about adding gender inclusive housing options for this sleepaway camp, and kind of some of the language we landed on was for cisgendered males, male identified people, and people who would feel safe kind of in that cabin. It's kind of, we talked about, and kind of, so keeping it broad. So for boys, for people who identify as male, and because this is a kids camp, so it's not obviously not adults and kids, because that's a different issue altogether. But cisgendered folks who identify as, and people who would be safe in that cabin is kind of the way. Because then for the folks who are non-binary, it opens up an option for them saying like, great, well, because it might be somebody who feels that they belong in what would be a boys' cabin, but maybe they don't identify as a boy, or they don't identify as, or they're not cisgender, they don't identify as a boy, but that's the right space for them. And so that's how we, language is complicated, right? We got to figure out how do we make things feel that they kind of fit to capture as many people as possible.
Thank you, Dante. I'll point out that the comment was made, I don't know how it is in the Episcopal Church, Dante, but it's not Baptist if there are no casseroles involved. So yeah, good. Donnie, how are we doing on time? I want to be.
Well, we're just about out of time, unless there's one more question, but I think that would be it. And then we need to start our wrap up.
Okay, so one other interesting question that might be helpful, there's a couple of folk have asked about it in different ways. And Donnie, you mentioned it earlier in terms of your own coming out journey when you were a younger person, you were attracted to guys, you were attracted to women.
Yes.
However, as you've gone through your transition, how might you describe your orientation at this point?
So I think, first of all, this is a really important question because there's a lot of confusion. I mean, it's one of the problems with LGBT because we put the four together and they belong together, but LGB is one thing and T is another. So part of this talks about who we love, right? And transgender talks about who we are. So when we find out who we are, that has nothing to do with who we might love. We may, as a transgender woman, I still am attracted to women. I have transgender women friends who are attracted to men, and I have some transgender women friends who, could go either way. I see a lot of young people, and what I hear from a lot of young people is this: I really don't care if they're a man or a woman or non-binary. What I care about is I love that person. And that becomes what's really, really important. And I would hope we could all get to that place where we could look beyond someone's sex and just look at, is this a person I love? Is this a person I care about? And who cares about me? And can we be in a meaningful relationship together? I just think that's a beautiful thing. And I just think we'd have a lot more happy domestic relationships if people got together on that basis, and not just because, I have a certain organ which makes me a male, therefore I have to be with someone who doesn't have one of those. Don't mean, if I was in college, I'd be a little cruder, but This is a church talk, so I'll keep it that way. Okay, I think that, unless, I don't know if Erica or Dante want to say something on that, because that's not an unimportant question. You want anything to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that for me has been really important. So, the narratives that are put upon us carry a lot more weight than we might expect, right? And so, as I'm in my early coming out process, I first came out as a lesbian, was like super butch, and then and because that's kind of where I thought I fit, and then as I learned more, it's like, oh, I'm trans. And at that point was in a relationship with a cis woman. We ended up getting married. And one of the things that I realized, and there's a comment about seminary. It's true in the Episcopal Church. I got to imagine it's true for other traditions of you go to seminary and they kind of break you down and then you get built back up. And one of the things that happened for me in seminary was I became aware of all of the narratives about my life that other people gave to me that I just said, okay, these are my narratives, and a whole lot of assumptions about who I would be. And in seminary, I learned to get rid of all those. And what I discovered was actually, I'm not attracted to women. I'm attracted to men. And so, I end up going through yet another kind of coming out process. My ex-wife was like, yeah, that's funny, because the more you transition, the more I realized, ooh, I'm not attracted to male identified people. I'm attracted to women. And so we had a very mutual divorce. But it was one of those things where it took a few stages and a few different moments in my life for me to realize, oh, yeah, I was only thinking I was attracted to women because I was like, oh, that's what I was told had to be true for me. And so, but this is where labels get complicated because, so I identify as queer, I identify as trans, and I identify as a gay man. And I have had people within the queer community tell me, no, you can't be a gay man because of your biology. And I'm like, so when I have clothes on, I'm gay, but when I don't, I'm then straight? Like, how does that work? And that's where I think also people get to claim the labels they want. And if it doesn't make sense for you, that's your problem. Not they don't have to conform to our understandings. But I think there's an important thing about that integrity, right? And authenticity, and allowing people the space to get rid of narratives that don't work for them and claim the narratives that do.
Thanks, Dante. And it's time for us to wrap up. So Erica, your final word.
Yeah, as we part, I just want to remind you all of what I remind my church as often as I can remember to, which is that we are all made in the image of God. And what that means is that in every person we meet, we learn that how different love can look from person to person, in situation to situation. And from every human being, we learn something different about what is sacred and what is holy. And that includes everybody, trans and cis, straight and gay, man and woman, and non-binary, and comrade, and all of the infinite genders out there.
Thanks, Erica. Dante?
One of the things that I try to share with my community is that God transcends our understanding, right? We can never fully know God. And in scripture, now, I mean, I'm an Episcopalian, so we don't quote scripture a whole lot. I mostly quote the prayer book, but right, scripture tells us in the creation stories, right, let's create humankind in our image, right? So we're all created in the image and likeness of God. And so if God can be beyond our understanding, if we can never fully know God, that means that humanity is also can be beyond our understandings. And so to hold our assumptions lightly, and to be open to people identifying in new and wonderful and varied ways, because all of those identities, all of those realities help us actually know God more. Because if we're creating the image and likeness of God, the more we understand humanity, the more then we come to understand God. So neither God nor people should be put in boxes and limited and constrained.
Thanks, Dante and Erica. I just want to say what a privilege it's been for me tonight to be able to share this webinar with Dante and Erica. I hope that our openness has not been offensive to people, but we've had to face things in our lives that have forced us to maybe be a little more open and question things that haven't been questioned in other circles. And just as Dante said, this is all part of the fact that we were made in the image of God. And like we do so often with God, we put our own boxes around God and limit God. And we do that to God's creation as well. I really want to thank the board of AWAB for the courage to be willing to allow three folks like us to speak our minds. That's really a wonderful thing. Thank you again, Dante and Erica. And thank you to each of you who've taken the time tonight to be with us. You've come together for your own reasons, perhaps some personal, perhaps some for your church, but you're open and you're asking good questions, and we're so grateful for that. And isn't that really what it's about, right? God has called us to be on a journey of faith together and learning. Sometimes the journey's a little bumpy, but God is with us. And so thank you everyone for joining us. And Brian, we'll turn it back to you, and thank you again and AWAB for hosting this and bringing this forward tonight. And hopefully it will make a difference in the lives of folks. Thank you.
Donnie, thank you. And Erica and Dante, thank you to each of you too for helping tonight be as good as it has been. We are excited to be able to offer these webinars as we shared at the beginning. This is the first in a series. We wanted to be careful not to be so restricted with what we were going to do. We wanted to kind of get a sense of how things would go and what the questions might be and how we can give shape and form to this. So know that we will be notifying everyone about our next webinar in this series, Welcoming the Transgender Community. Also, I'll encourage you to visit the AWAB website if you haven't. We are continuing to update it by the week, and so there's always new information there. If you would like to make a gift to AWAB, know that you can do that by visiting the website and using the donate feature. You can even find out about the new Rainbow Circle, which we have created, and it's an opportunity for individuals to help support the work that we do. I always like to say, in the spirit of being Baptist and Episcopalian, in the spirit of being human, there is far more we can do together than any of us can do on our own. So in this spirit, let's continue to do together what we can't do on our own. Let's continue to listen and learn from each other so that we can be the image of a God and of a Christ that we want people to know, and who can embrace us each for being exactly who we are. Thank you everyone for being with us tonight, and we will see you again hopefully soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.